As you can see, the subject of this video is the poem Penguin on the Beach by Ruth Miller. She is a South African poet, but this is not an exclusively South African poem. I mean, obviously, penguins are something that we're accustomed to seeing, but this, as you can tell from the title, is quite a generalized poem. It could be any penguin, and it could be on any beach. I think, quite a simple poem. I think you'll be able to understand it quite easily, but it's got a sad message because it's one about pollution and about the impact of humans on the environment. And so, to that extent, it's quite sad. But I'm going to break it down quite a lot for you. So this might be a little of a long video, but you will definitely understand it at the end. And hopefully, if you do understand it well, this is one of the poems you get in your final, and it will be useful to you. There's just two things I want to note before we start. The first is a reminder that there are often a number of different ways of interpreting a poem. And so it's quite possible that some of the things that I say here might not be the same as what your teacher has told you, or there might be things that I'm saying here that your teacher has not said. Just because you are not hearing a uniform kind of interpretation of the poem does not mean that one is right and one is wrong. There are many potential interpretations for a poem. So just keep that in mind. Ask questions. If you're not sure, ask your teacher, ask me. It doesn't matter. We are not personally invested in our interpretations of these poems. The second thing that I would like to reinforce quite strongly is for you not to just listen passively to this video. Just kind of sit and let it run over you. It's not going to be useful to you. You're going to hear it. It's going to sound like it makes sense, which in your head is going to equate to you knowing it. And those are not the same things. So just because it makes sense and you understand it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to remember it. So I would strongly recommend that while you are listening to this, you also take notes that are useful to you. Either annotate a copy of the poem itself or take notes on things that you maybe didn't, were not sure of, or you didn't hear before. Make some kind of notes as you are listening to this. Be an active listener, because the only other way that you'll remember it if you don't listen more actively is if you listen to this video like 5 or 6 times. And trust me, neither of us wants you to do that. Okay, so listen actively. And if there are things that you are not sure of after you've watched this, ask your teacher, ask me. You know how to get hold of me. My details are at the end of this slideshow. They're on the website. Or ask your teacher, get clarification. Don't go into things with uncertainty. Okay, I'm going to start by reading the poem. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I want you to look, as I'm reading it, look at the structure of the verses. This poem makes extensive use of enjambment, something that you should be familiar with by now. Enjambment is when the line gets cut off halfway through the sentence. And of course, what you know about enjambment by now is that it emphasizes the point of the break. So look carefully at where those breaks occur. I'm going to read it as if, just quite a smooth reading, and you will notice the difference between the structure, where the verses end and where the sentence ends. And as that is happening, take note of what the poet is seeking to emphasize by using enjambment. Okay, once I've done that, I'll break it down into some other sort of smaller pieces of analysis for you. But otherwise, let's get started. Stranger in his own element, sea casualty. The castaway mannequin waddles in his tailored coat-tails. Oil has spread a deep commercial stain over his downy shirt front. Sleazy, grey, it clogs the sleekness. Far too well he must recall the past to be so cautious. Watch him step into the waves. He shudders under the froth, slides, slips on the wet sand, escaping to dryness, dearth, in a white cascade, an involuntary shouldering off of gleam. Hands push him back into the sea. He stands in pained and silent expostulation. Once he knew a sunlit leaping smoothness. But close, with his head small knoll, and dark, he retains the image. Oil on sea, green slicks, black lassos of sludge sleeving the breakers in a stain-sprayed scarf. He shudders now from the clean, flinching wave, turns and plods back up the yellow sand, ineffably weary, triumphantly sad. He is immensely wise. He trusts nobody. His senses are clogged with experience. He eats fish from the Saviour's hands, and it tastes black. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do is run through a little bit of vocabulary for you. I've assumed that there are possibly some words that you might not be familiar with. I may be wrong, of course. Some of you might know a lot of these. So I've just highlighted a couple of those that are possibly not familiar to you. You will have access to the slideshow itself independently of this video, so there's no need to go through each of these words. I'm not going to run through them in this particular video, but they are present in the slideshow itself, words that possibly you might not have encountered before. And as I go through the poem, I will also highlight those words. So make a note of those that you have not seen before, any that you were not previously familiar with, and just keep those in mind as we run through the poem. And if you do need to revisit this particular slide, you can do it on the slideshow itself. As I said to you before, I want you to just take note of the structure. You can see that this is a fairly uniform poem. Actually, it's not fairly uniform, it is uniform. Although it doesn't have a rhyme scheme, it does have quite a rigid structure. It is 8 stanzas of 3 lines each. And that is deliberate because if you were to compare the poem, were I to take away all of the enjambment, so if we were to look at it as just a group of sentences, you can see that it looks very different. So what I've done with this is I've just taken the poem and shifted the emphasis slightly. I've prevented that enjambment from being a characteristic of the poem, which, when you go back to what the poem looks like, makes it very clear just how conscious and how prevalent the use of enjambment is in the poem. Almost every stanza ends with enjambment. Not every single one, but almost every single one. And of course, there is a reason for that. I will also revisit this as we go into the stanza by stanza analysis that we're going to do. So I'm going to analyze 2 stanzas at a time. As I said, get ready to take some notes if you need to. We'll start with this first stanza, and the most notable thing about this first stanza is the first line, which contains a paradox, that this penguin is a stranger in his own element. To be in your element means to feel comfortable, where you belong. If you were to say to somebody that person's really in their element, it is saying that they feel like they're in the exact right place where they're supposed to be. Of course, there's also a reference to water as being an element, but this particular penguin has become a stranger in his own element. And I'm sure that you can see that there's a kind of betrayal in that. There's a shock in the fact that you are now a stranger in the place where you should most belong. So that is the poem starts on this paradox that this is the position that the penguin finds himself in. And that betrayal is reinforced by the use of the word castaway. A castaway is a person who has been sort of lost as a result of a shipwreck, or has been abandoned or stranded, is alone in some way. And that betrayal is reinforced by the use of that word castaway, which implies that the sea, the element that should have been the penguin's home, has abandoned the penguin, or at least this is what the penguin feels like. And if you look at the diction in this first stanza, you'll see that quite a lot of what is talked about here relates to some kind of, it suggests some kind of violence. A casualty is somebody who's been negatively affected by something. And so you've got here the fact that the penguin is both a casualty and a castaway. None of these is a good way to be. You've also got the consonants on the hard C, the alliteration here, the casualty, castaway, coattails, commercial, clogs. These are all, this is all alliteration, of course, alliteration or consonants, because it's an emphasis on that consonant. And it's a hard sound, which contrasts with the kind of smooth sound that you would expect to associate with the C. As I mentioned before, here's your example of enjambment. The oil has spread. Emphasis here on the oil. Do you see that the word oil is the last word of that stanza? So you've got initially, this stanza that says that the penguin is a stranger, and it leaves the question, well, why is the stranger in this particular position? And you get the answer straight away. The answer is oil. Oil is the reason for where he finds himself at this point. So there's heavy emphasis on oil, moving towards the fact that the oil has spread a commercial stain over the penguin. Look at the words in the second stanza. The downy shirt front, that's the white front of the penguin. And look at the contrast with downy, which would have been soft and white. Down is, you get like down duvets and down pillows. Down are the very, very soft white feathers on the underside of a bird usually. And that is contrasted with the sleazy gray clogging of what the oil is doing. And the fact that it's called a commercial stain tells you exactly what the motivation is for this particular situation. It gives us some insight as to why this pollution is taking place. It's because of commerce. It's a commercial reason. Now, the next stanza doesn't have this far too well. So far too well is the last three words of this stanza. Again, it's another piece of enjambment. So this stanza ends with, it clogs the sleekness far too well. And then we move on to the next stanza, which says, he must recall the past. So he remembers clearly what has happened to him. And the reason why this line exists is because where we see the penguin now, he's being described as cautious. He doesn't want to go into the water. So look at the stanza. Far too well he must recall the past to be so cautious. Watch him step into the waves. He shudders. Okay, so what's happening here is that this penguin doesn't want to go back into the water. And so the question that we're left with is, why wouldn't he want to go back into the water? And the reason why is because he remembers too clearly what has happened to him. So he is now, as a result of his experiences, apprehensive about going back to what should be his natural environment, because his natural environment has caused him pain. Look at the colon there. So you've got a colon which suggests what's happening next. He's so cautious, and the evidence of his cautiousness is the way in which he steps into the waves. Watch him step into the waves. That watch him is an instruction to you, the reader. It says here, look, it places that picture in your mind. It makes it present. Do you see that the tense that's being used in this line is present tense? Watch him step into the waves. He's in the process of doing it. We see him doing that. So we now become a spectator. We see what is happening to the penguin. If you look at the diction of that particular stanza, and I'm going to refer to both of them in that. So this is essentially the third stanza. Look at the words that are significant here. Think about the word shudder. When do you shudder? What causes you to shudder? Usually, you shudder. First of all, it's an involuntary type of action. Shuddering is often involuntary. It's instinctive, and often you shudder because you are repulsed by something, or you feel it's generally an unpleasant sort of expression. The minute he approaches the water, he involuntarily wants to move away from it. And look at the other words here: froth and slide and slip. All of those could relate to both the way water usually is, or the way water would be if it was polluted. So there's a kind of an ambiguity here, because there's the froth on the waves, which, if you look later on in the poem, we realize the waves are actually clean. But we only find this out later. At this point, though, for him, the waves are associated with pollution. There's that froth that would indicate the pollution of the waves, and the slipping and the sliding on the wet sand. Look at the sibilants there: slip, slide, sand. This comes through again later in the poem as well. A lot of alliteration on the S sounds. Now, the slipperiness again has a sort of an ambiguity to it, because water would be something that you would slide in, but so would oil. So there, it creates this sense of uncertainty and unsteadiness in a place where he actually should have felt secure. So what does he do as a result of that? He doesn't want to go back into the sea. So he escapes. He leaves the sea. He escapes to dryness. Now, for a penguin, dryness would not seem to be a good place to be. And in this particular case, you've got the same thing. The dryness is not pleasant for him. It's associated with dearth. Look at the alliteration there: dryness, dearth, cascade. So you've got the D sounds there, which again are hard again. The place that he's going to is not welcoming, but for him, he would rather be there than in the sea because of the fact that he associates the sea with being with the pollution. Again, this is a paradox because the place that he's going to, dearth, as I said to you before, is an absence of everything, an absence of water and food and shelter. And so he's escaping, but he's escaping to a place that is not pleasant for him. In the wake of him attempting to escape, he immediately gets pushed back into the sea. So the hands pushing him back into the sea are ironic because they're trying to help him. These hands, these are the hands of people who have cleaned him and who have rescued him and who are trying to reintroduce him to what should have been his home. But notice the impersonal aspect of those hands. I actually haven't written it into the slideshow here, but the hands pushing him back into the sea is, of course, some of you might remember, an example of metonymy, because the hands, just the hands on their own, are being used to represent the overall human aspect of things. And the sad thing about it is that the human quality is attempting to help, but it's the human interference that is also the cause of the harm. Again, look at the enjambment here. The last words of this stanza are actually the first words of the next sentence. So the hands push him back into the sea. He stands. There's a finality to that. He doesn't want to move. He just is going to stand exactly where he is right now. He stands in pained and silent expostulation. Now, both of these words, the pain and the silence, indicate, sadness. So you've got the remainder of the previous stanza, the small act of defiance, but it's all that he can do is to just stand there and be silent. The silence is even sadder by virtue of the fact that he can't even express his pain. He's just standing there. I mean, I'm sure you can get a picture in your head of this little penguin just sort of standing there at the edge of the sea, not wanting to go in. That's the only thing that he can do. And the expostulation, as I said, as you might have noticed right in the beginning, is an expression of disapproval. Usually when somebody's trying to make you do something, if you expostulate, then you disapprove of what you are being tried to be made to do. So he is actually sort of indirectly dissuading these people from trying to push him back into the sea. What is he trying to stop them doing? In a small way, he's trying to just stop these people from pushing him back into the sea. But indirectly, you've got the suggestion here that what should we be dissuading people from doing? We should be dissuading them from polluting the sea. Now, I want you to look at the pace of the next two lines. So this line, the once he knew line, and then the next one after that, there's a distinct contrast in the pace. If you look at this first line, it has a kind of a regular rhythm to it. Once he knew a sunlit leaping smoothness. It has a flow. The flow of that line mimics the action that it would describe, a sunlit leaping smoothness. Can you see that sort of idea of, I mean, you've seen penguins swimming through the sea, the way they sort of come up and down, they bob up into the water, up out of the water and down again. That's what that line is mimicking. And it's contrasted directly with the next line, which doesn't have that rhythm. So if you look at the rhythm of the previous line, once he knew a sunlit leaping smoothness, doesn't work in the next line. The next line doesn't have that kind of flowing rhythm. But close, with his head's small knoll and dark. Do you see how different the emphasis is? It doesn't have that sort of beat to it. Because this line is a contrast to what was before. He knew that kind of ease and flow, and now he's got the memory of this discomfort. What's being expressed in this line is that this closeness means like in his head, in that little small round head of his. What's there? The image. It's the image that he retains. So if you look at the diction there, the close indicates the recentness of memory. The knoll is the little rounded shape of his head. And do you see that similar to the first stanza, this ends on the word dark, a negative word, a word that has obviously dark connotations, that has connotations of that are contrasted with the sunlight, the sunlit in the line before that. And what's in his head is this image. He retains the image. And what is the image of? Everything in this next stanza relates to how gross the oil is. Look at all of the words in this particular stanza. Oil on sea, green slicks, black lassos of sludge, sleeving the breakers in a stain spread scarf. Can you hear again the sibilance of this line, the S's? Have you noticed that so far all of the S's are linked to oil? So whenever there's a kind of a sibilance, it relates to the sort of slipperiness of the oil. I've obviously noted there what all of those words mean. I think that's self-explanatory. But what you must look out for, what's notable here amongst all of this S is that it's not a pleasant kind of S. It's not a smooth, soft sort of sibilance. It's a slippery, sticky, oil-related kind of sibilance. So if you get any questions about the effect of the alliteration in this stanza, you know exactly what you're talking about. You're talking about the slipperiness of the oil and how that's being emphasized by the repeated use of the S sound all the way through this particular stanza. If you look also at what is being described, slick, lassos, sleeves, scarves. What are all of those things? Those are all things that wrap or cover or encompass the sea. When the oil is on the sea, it covers it entirely. A lasso is a thing that captures something, isn't it? The sea has been captured by these lassos of sludge. And when you are wearing something with sleeves, your arm is enwrapped by that sleeve. If you've got a scarf, the scarf is around your neck. Do you see that all of the things that are being described here are things that surround and, in this case, suffocate, which is also a good word to use because it's got the S in it as well there. So the oil surrounds and suffocates the sea and, by extension, the penguin in the sea. We see here in this stanza, these last two stanzas, a repetition of the word shudder. So you will have noticed shudder from beforehand, and here you've got shudder again. So you've got a couple of words here that relate to this involuntary, instinctive drawing back from the sea. So there's the repetition again of the shudders. And it is linked in this particular line to the idea of flinching. Shuddering and flinching are, can you see how they're sort of linked? When do you flinch? You flinch when somebody, when someone's about to hit you and you sort of step back quickly. That's a flinch. When you are afraid that you're going to get hurt in some way, or when you're trying to avoid something, just as with the shuddering, both of these words are linked in that they both express actually the penguin's instinctive revulsion for the waves. And remember, these are the waves that should have been his natural element. The term flinching wave, I don't know if any of you have picked this up on your own, but what do you call it when one thing is given a description that actually relates to another thing. I don't know if you remember this. This is a transferred epithet. It's not the wave that is flinching. It is the penguin that is flinching. So in this case, yes, the wave might sort of mimic that kind of motion, but actually the transferred epithet is being used to describe the penguin. Take a note here of what's actually happening. Remember in the second stanza where we first saw the penguin resisting the waves, where we were talking about the froth and the slipping and the sliding, and it seemed to suggest that the waves were polluted and that's why he didn't want to go into them. That's not the case at all. We see here confirmation of the fact that actually the sea is clean. Everything is clean. The clean flinching waves and the yellow sand. So you've got indications here that the beach is fine, but he just doesn't want to be part of it anymore. And the reason why, of course, is that he has had this experience. But of course, what is being emphasized here again is that for a penguin to be afraid of the sea is just so sad. How bad could his experience have been that he doesn't want to go back to his natural home? It's deeply sad. That phrase, triumphantly sad, is an oxymoron, because you should know, of course, that if you're triumphant, you should be joyful and happy, and triumph expresses victory over something. And so if you're victorious, you certainly shouldn't be sad. But also, what would he be victorious over? He feels like he's victorious over the sea. He hasn't been forced to be pushed back into the sea, so he's triumphant. But of course, the sadness is because he's not going back to his environment. Take a look at some of the diction there. The word plod is a sort of a slow, stomping kind of walk. I don't know if you've ever seen like a little kid who doesn't want to do something, dragging their feet and sort of stomping them down. A tired, lethargic, reluctant kind of walk. That's plodding. Plodding might be the way you walk to your last lesson of the day, or the way you are walking to the car and when you're about to leave school. It's when you're just tired. Okay. And there's that word ineffable, which I pointed out in the beginning. Ineffable is indescribable. It is too great to be described in words. Ineffably is normally used to describe something beautiful. So again, you've got the kind of oxymoron there, actually, because it would almost be like saying beautifully tired, which is not the case. I mean, he's just weary, but this is not weary. Sorry, I used the wrong word by saying tired there. Weary is tired. This is wary. He is afraid. He is cautious. He is aware. And it links, so the ineffably and the triumphantly and this kind of creates a link between these two stanzas. Look at all of these. These are all adverbs that he's describing, that are being used to describing here. Ineffably wary, triumphantly sad, and immensely wise. An emphasis on the point that he has been brought to right now. And there again, you have a colon. All of these things add up to one thing: the wariness, the sadness, the wisdom. It all combines. And what does it combine to result in? It results in the fact that he trusts nobody. So he is not going to, even those people that helped him, he doesn't trust them either. Why doesn't he trust them? Because his senses, and here's enjambment again, his senses, like the sea, are clogged with experience. This is a metaphor for, this is where his senses are also being compared to the sea itself. In the same way that the sea was clogged with oil, his senses are clogged with his experience of that oil. Not only has he been physically dragged down by it, but even though he's been cleaned and even though the oil has been physically removed from him, the humans cannot remove the memory that he has of that experience. That will never be removed. And the evidence of that is the fact that he will not go back to the water. That's what demonstrates that. This use of the word savior, particularly because it's capitalized, is a reference to, that's a biblical reference. And you've got also the biblical reference to the fish, the Savior, Jesus feeding fish to his flock. That was a sort of an act of kindness, of religious kindness. He eats this fish from the Savior's hands, but it's ironic that, again, these hands, that metonymy, are also the things that have caused him that pain. And then look at the way that this line ends. It tastes black. You will recall that 2 stanzas back, the line ended on the word dark. And 2 stanzas back from that, the line ended on the word oil. So you've got oil, dark, and black. And that's the emphasis. And of course, that is also deeply ironic because fish should not taste black. Black should not be a word that you would associate necessarily with any taste. And of course, the black itself is a word that has terrible connotations. Black does not have connotations of life and light and all of the things that one should associate with food. So it's deliberately meant to be kind of shocking that the line ends on that. You've also got a couple of other things happening in this line. The allusion here is a biblical one. So this line is alluding to the idea of a biblical savior, of somebody coming to save you from your struggles. But of course, it's being used ironically. And the other thing that's happening in this line is synesthesia. And synesthesia, for those of you that don't know, is the swapping of senses. So you would normally say something tastes sweet or sour. In this case, the senses are being the sense of taste is being related to something that you would normally see. So taste is now being associated with color. That is synesthesia. So if you were to sort of combine different senses, you could hear a color, or you could see a sound, or you could taste a sound. If you mix up your senses, that's synesthesia. And that's another of the devices that's being employed here. So you can see that last line is just packed full of impact. The irony of being saved, the allusion to the reference of the biblical kind of saving, and this added impact of taking the word black, which is strongly associated with oil, and linking it to food, which now, because it's been linked, now it doesn't seem to be the nourishing thing that it should be. The food, the fish, is now black. It is not what it should be. So let's look at a couple of the overarching ideas that are in this poem. Let's look at color. A lot of the poem deals with color. There is the color that is associated with the clean, natural side of things. So if you look at those parts of the poem that relate to things that are clean, both directly and indirectly. So if you look at things like the tailored coattails and the froth, those give you sort of, black and white kind of colors, along with the downiness, the white. This is all clean, white, fresh. The clean wave, the yellow sand, these are all related to something that is clean and natural. So that's the one side of the colors. And then the other side of the colors are the polluted, unnatural colors like gray and the gleam, which is the gleam of the oil. Look at the darkness, all of the colors associated with oil, green and black and stained. And again, the emphasis of black. Looking at the poem again, it's in its entirety here. Take note again of where the poem ends on colors that are dark, or where it relates to things that are dark. Oil in the first stanza, dark in the fourth, and black in the final stanza. And the repetition of those. I mean, you don't just get it once, you get black repeated a couple of times. Another concept that we can look at is how often oil is referenced. I mean, obviously it's a massive part of the poem, but if you get any kind of broad question relating to diction, or anything that asks you to look at the poem as a whole, then scan over the words that scan over it and look for words that relate to some of these larger concepts. Look at all of the words in the poem that are linked expressly with oil. There's lots of them, and they are repeated as well. So you've got the clogged and clogged here. Initially, in the second stanza, it's the oil that clogged him, and in the final stanza, it's his experience. It's his senses that are clogged with experience. Again, a lot of those are color words, but they do relate to oil and everything that kind of can be associated with it right the way through the poem. In terms of tone, obviously, I hope you picked up on the fact that the tone is sad and slow and melancholic and defeated and despondent. And there's a number of words that relate to that as well. The fact that he's a casualty, that he's a victim of some sort of violence. Look at those other words: grey, shudder, a dearth, just the absence of anything, pain, silence, the repetition of the shuddering, the plodding. He plods, he's weary, he's sad. These are all words that combine to convey an almost unchanging tone. This is not a poem where the tone changes from one part of the poem to the other. It is despondent all the way through. So in summary, what you've got is a poem that has a clear message, but it's not an overt message. So this is not a kind of we must do something about the planet message. What is happening here is that through the creation of the picture of this single sad, poignant penguin, you get a greater environmental message. It reminds me of that quote by Joseph Stalin that said that the death of one man is a tragedy, the death of millions is a statistic. I think the poem is kind of doing a similar sort of thing in saying, yes, we know how bad everything is, and we know the climate change and pollution, etc., etc. But when you bring it back down to one single thing and you just allow the reader to glimpse that thing, that's more effective in creating an emotional connection with that one thing. More so by virtue of the fact that the penguin has almost been personified in this poem, through the use of the words like little mannequin. He's like a little person we identify. The poet hopes that we identify with this little creature that has been so negatively affected by its experiences of humanity that it no longer even feels at home in the place where it should feel at home, which is its natural environment. I mean, the whole concept of natural environment has been turned on its head in this poem. So that's the larger picture of that, and that's the overall message, your takeaway from that. Whatever questions you get, look at the poem through the lens of its greater purpose, which I think is this environmental message.